There's a specific kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones of certain people. Not the exhaustion that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little, but something deeper, older. It's the exhaustion of someone who was never allowed to be soft, who learned responsibility before they learned multiplication, who understood survival before they understood innocence. If you know what it feels like to be the calm one during chaos, the reliable one when adults fell apart, the person everyone leaned on when you were still learning to stand yourself, then you know this exhaustion. You know what it means to have been a child who had to act like an adult. And that early transformation, that premature shedding of childhood, leaves marks that psychology is only beginning to fully understand. Insight 1: The weight of an invisible crown. Picture a home where the normal order of things has quietly collapsed. Maybe there's a parent battling addiction, their presence unpredictable as weather. Maybe there's mental illness painting the walls with tension, or poverty stretching every resource thin as wire. Maybe there's just absence, an empty chair at dinner where guidance should sit. In these spaces, something happens that shouldn't. A child, often without anyone noticing or naming it, begins to fill the void. They become the one who remembers to pay bills, who talks their siblings through nightmares, who holds their parents' hand through anxiety attacks, who learns to read the room for danger before they can read chapter book. This phenomenon has a name in psychology. It's called parentification, and it describes what happens when the invisible boundary between parent and child dissolves, when roles reverse and a young person is forced to take on responsibilities that exceed not just their age, but their developmental capacity. The term was coined by family therapist Ivan Basarmeni-Inagi, who recognized that some children don't get to graduate slowly into adulthood. Instead, they're thrown into it, often before they've learned what childhood even means. Parentification doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. It's not always a child cooking dinner for younger siblings or dropping out of school to work. Sometimes it's subtler, more invisible. It's the 8-year-old who becomes their mother's therapist, listening to adult problems about money and relationship. It's the teenager who mediates their parents' fights, trying to keep peace in a war they didn't start. It's the child who learns to swallow their own needs because asking for help feels like adding weight to an already sinking ship. These children become experts at reading emotional weather, at anticipating crisis, at making themselves small so others can take up space. What makes this particularly insidious is that these children are often praised for it. Adults call them mature, responsible, wise beyond their years. Teachers marvel at how together they seem, how they never cause trouble. Friends' parents say they wish their kids were as helpful. But this praise masks a quiet theft. Because what looks like maturity is often just survival dressed up in competence. What seems like wisdom is frequently just a childhood sacrificed on the altar of necessity. The brain of a parentified child learns early that their value comes from what they provide, not from who they are. They learn that love is something you earn through usefulness, that rest is a luxury reserved for people who don't have families depending on them. And so they grow, carrying this invisible crown that nobody else can see. They move through their days looking normal, acting normal, achieving and excelling and never causing problems. But underneath, they're managing a full-time job that most adults would struggle with. They're raising themselves while raising others. They're building an identity around being needed while never learning how to need. The childhood that should have been spent playing, exploring, failing safely, and being cared for becomes instead a training ground for premature adulthood. Time moves differently for these children. While their peers worry about homework and friendships, they worry about whether there's food in the house, whether their parent will make it through the night, whether their siblings are safe. The concerns that should arrive gradually over decades crash into them all at once. And the brain, still developing, still forming, has to adapt. Insight 2: The two faces of growing up too fast. Parentification reveals itself in two distinct forms: though they often intertwine like threads in a complicated weave. The first is emotional parentification, where a child becomes their parent's confidant, counselor, or emotional regulator. Picture a 10-year-old listening to their mother's dating struggles, or a teenager absorbing their father's work stress, nodding along to problems they have no framework to understand. These children become repositories for adult anxiety, adult conflict, adult pain. They learn to manage emotions that aren't theirs, to solve problems they didn't create, to comfort grief they're too young to contextualize. Research shows that emotional parentification can be particularly damaging because it's so confusing for a child's developing sense of reality. Children in these situations often don't have the cognitive tools to properly process what they're experiencing. They might read court documents about their parents' divorce, learn intimate details about financial crises, or become mediators in adult conflict. They're given information they can't fully comprehend, then expected to handle it with grace they haven't yet developed. This creates what psychologists call a distortion in the family structure, where the child essentially becomes a peer to their parent rather than a child to be protected. The developmental consequences ripple outward. These children often struggle with something called emotional regulation because they were forced to regulate others' emotions before learning to regulate their own. The second form is instrumental parentification, which involves physical labor and household management. This is the child who does the bulk of cooking and cleaning, who gets siblings ready for school, who manages schedules and appointments, who might even work jobs to contribute financially. While this form might seem more straightforward, more about tasks than emotions, it carries its own unique burdens. These children sacrifice time that should be spent on education, on social development, on play. They miss out on extracurriculars because they have to be home to watch younger siblings. They fall behind in school not because they lack ability, but because they're simply too exhausted from managing a household. Interestingly, research suggests that instrumental parentification, while still harmful, may sometimes lead to more positive outcomes than emotional parentification. When children take on household tasks, the responsibilities are at least predictable and tangible. There's a clear beginning and end to doing dishes, to helping with homework. But emotional parentification is boundless, shapeless. There's no clear endpoint to being someone's therapist, no obvious completion to managing a parent's anxiety. The emotional burden stretches infinitely, colonizing every quiet moment. But here's what both forms share, what unites them in their impact. They occur during critical periods of brain development, when neural pathways are still forming, when the architecture of personality is still under construction. The human brain doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s, and during childhood and adolescence, it's particularly plastic, particularly vulnerable to environmental shaping. When a child experiences chronic stress from adult responsibilities, their brain adapts, but not in ways that serve them well long-term. The constant state of vigilance, the unrelenting responsibility, the absence of a protective buffer, all of these reshape how the brain processes stress, relationships, and self-worth. Studies have found that ongoing stress from parentification can actually shrink the hippocampus, the part of the brain crucial for memory formation, emotional regulation, and stress management. This isn't just a metaphor. The physical structure of the brain changes under the weight of premature responsibility. The amygdala, which processes fear and threat, may become hyperreactive, always scanning for danger, never fully resting. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, decision-making, and impulse control, may develop differently when forced to engage in adult-level reasoning before it's ready. These children's brains are essentially rewired by necessity, optimized for survival and caretaking rather than for the exploratory learning and secure attachment that should characterize healthy development. Insight 3: The architecture of a changed brain. To understand what happens to a parentified child's brain, you have to understand something fundamental about human neurodevelopment. Our brains are designed to develop in stages, each building on the last, each requiring certain conditions to unfold properly. In a healthy childhood, the brain learns to regulate stress with the help of caregivers who provide what psychologists call a secure base. When something frightening happens, a young child looks to their parent, and the parent's calm response teaches the child's brain that the world is manageable, that threats can be handled, that they don't have to face danger alone. Over time, this co-regulation becomes self-regulation. The child internalizes the parent's calming presence and develops their own capacity to manage difficult emotions. But when a child becomes parentified, this process inverts. Instead of receiving regulation, they're expected to provide it. Instead of having someone model calmness during stress, they have to generate it themselves while also managing their parents' dysregulation. Their nervous system never learns that rest is possible, that safety exists, that someone else will step in when things get hard. The result is a brain that develops with the assumption that high alert is the baseline, that vigilance is survival, that letting your guard down is dangerous. This manifests in measurable, physical ways. Research examining the brains of adults who experienced childhood adversity, including parentification, has found consistent patterns of altered brain structure and function. The hippocampus, which we mentioned earlier, shows reduced volume in many of these individuals. This matters because the hippocampus isn't just about memory, it's also crucial for contextualizing experiences and for providing feedback to shut down the stress response once a threat has passed. When it's compromised, people struggle to distinguish between past and present threats, to turn off their alarm system even when they're safe. They live in a state of perpetual bracing, always expecting the next crisis. The amygdala, meanwhile, may become overactive. This almond-shaped structure deep in the brain is responsible for detecting threats and triggering the fear response. In parentified individuals, the amygdala often remains hypervigilant, interpreting neutral situations as potentially dangerous. This is why many adults who were parentified as children struggle with anxiety, constantly scanning their environment for problems, unable to fully relax even in objectively safe situations. Their brains learned early that missing a warning sign could mean disaster, so they never stop looking. Then there's the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control center. This region, which continues developing well into the 20s, is responsible for planning, decision-making, emotional regulation, and impulse control. When children are forced into adult decision-making before this area has matured, it has to work overtime, developing under stress rather than in the protected environment it requires. Some studies suggest this can lead to both precocious development in certain areas and deficits in others. These individuals might be exceptionally good at crisis management and problem-solving but struggle with tasks that require them to relax, to be spontaneous, to trust that someone else will handle things. The body's stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, also undergoes changes. This system is supposed to activate during genuine threats, releasing cortisol and adrenaline to help us respond, then shut down once the danger passes. But chronic activation during childhood can dysregulate this entire system. Some parentified adults end up with flattened cortisol responses, where their bodies no longer react appropriately to stress because they've been in stress mode for so long. Others develop exaggerated responses, where minor stressors trigger major physiological reactions. Either way, their internal alarm system no longer functions as designed. What's particularly tragic is that these changes happen during what neuroscientists call sensitive periods, windows of time when the brain is especially receptive to environmental input. The experiences we have during these windows literally shape the architecture of our neural circuits in ways that are difficult to reverse later. It's not that change is impossible, the brain retains plasticity throughout life, but it requires significant, intentional work to rewire patterns that were established so early and so deeply. Insight 4: The Paradox of Strength and Fragility. Here's where the story of parentification becomes genuinely complicated, where the clean narrative of damage and harm gives way to something more nuanced and more human. Because the truth is, not every outcome of parentification is negative. In fact, research consistently finds that some individuals who were parentified as children develop remarkable strength. They become resilient, independent, highly capable adults. They're often described as empathetic, responsible, natural leaders. They handle crises with a calmness that others marvel at. They possess what some psychologists call earned resilience, a toughness forged in fire. Studies have found that certain factors can tip parentification toward these more adaptive outcomes. When children feel that their contributions are valued and appreciated, when they perceive their responsibilities as fair rather than exploitative, when they maintain strong relationships with siblings who share the burden, when they have at least one supportive adult outside the immediate family, these elements can serve as protective factors. In some cultures, particularly those that emphasize family interdependence and collective responsibility, taking on caregiving roles may even align with cultural values in ways that feel affirming rather than burdensome. Some individuals who were parentified report that the experience taught them invaluable skills. They learned early how to manage households, how to be organized, how to anticipate needs and solve problems. They developed emotional intelligence beyond their years, an ability to read people and situations that serves them well in relationships and careers. They carry a sense of competence, a knowledge that they can handle whatever life throws at them because they've already survived so much. But here's the paradox, the part that makes this so psychologically complex. These strengths often coexist with profound struggles. An adult who is exceptionally competent at work might simultaneously be unable to ask for help when they need it. Someone who seems remarkably resilient might be secretly falling apart because they never learned that it's okay to fall apart. The same person praised for their emotional intelligence might struggle to access their own emotions because they spent so long managing everyone else's. Research on adults who were parentified reveals a consistent pattern. Many struggle with relationships, particularly romantic ones. They often unconsciously seek out partners who need caretaking, recreating the dynamic they grew up with. Or they swing the other direction, becoming so fiercely independent that they can't let anyone in, can't be vulnerable, can't accept care even when it's offered genuinely. Trust becomes complicated when your earliest relationship taught you that adults are unreliable, that you can only depend on yourself. Intimacy becomes fraught when your sense of worth is tied to being needed rather than simply being loved. Boundaries present another major challenge. People who were parentified often report feeling responsible for everyone around them, unable to say no, constantly taking on more than they can handle. They might describe feeling guilty when they prioritize their own needs, as if self-care is somehow selfish. They've internalized the message that their value comes from what they provide, and rest feels like abandonment. Even in situations where they're clearly overextended, they struggle to delegate or to acknowledge their limit. Many also wrestle with perfectionism and overachievement. Having learned that mistakes were costly, that they had to get things right because no one else would catch them if they fell, they developed impossibly high standards for themselves. They might be successful by external measures, excelling in careers, maintaining spotless homes, seeming to have it all together. But internally, they're exhausted, driven by fear rather than passion, unable to give themselves the grace they readily extend to others. There's also a pattern of what psychologists call hypervigilance and anticipatory anxiety. Adults who were parentified often report feeling constantly on edge, always waiting for something to go wrong, unable to fully enjoy good moments because they're scanning for the next crisis. Even when life is objectively stable, their nervous system remains primed for disaster because disaster was the norm for so long. Perhaps most poignant is the identity confusion many experience. When asked who they are outside of their role as helper, caretaker, problem solver, they often struggle to answer. Their entire sense of self was built around being useful to others. They might have interests and hobbies, but these feel secondary to their primary identity as the person who shows up, who handles things, who keeps everything running. Learning to simply be, without a role to fill or a crisis to manage, can feel deeply uncomfortable, almost threatening. Insight 5: The Long Road to Reclaiming Childhood. Healing from parentification is possible, but it's not a straightforward journey. It requires something that might sound simple but feels monumentally difficult for people with this history. It requires learning to receive care without guilt, to acknowledge needs without shame, to be vulnerable without fear. For someone who spent their formative years being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who held everyone else up, these tasks can feel nearly impossible. Therapy often becomes a crucial part of this healing process, though it brings its own challenges. Many parentified adults struggle to engage with therapy authentically because their default mode is to take care of the therapist, to minimize their own pain, to present as more okay than they actually are. They might intellectualize their experiences, analyzing their childhood with detachment rather than feeling the grief and anger that live underneath. Learning to be the one who receives support rather than provides it requires a fundamental rewiring of relational patterns. Several therapeutic approaches have shown effectiveness in addressing parentification trauma. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy helps individuals identify and challenge the distorted beliefs they developed, beliefs like their worth depends on their usefulness or that asking for help is weakness. Dialectical behavioral therapy teaches emotional regulation skills they never learned as children, helping them identify and sit with their own feelings rather than immediately shifting into problem-solving mode. Family therapy, when possible, can help repair relationships by re-establishing appropriate boundaries and roles, though this requires willingness from the parents to acknowledge the harm done, which isn't always forthcoming. One powerful aspect of healing involves something called inner child work, a therapeutic approach where individuals learn to connect with and reparent the child they once were. This might sound abstract, but it involves genuinely grieving for the childhood that was lost, acknowledging the weight that young person carried, validating the pain they felt but couldn't express. It means learning to offer themselves the compassion and care they never received, becoming the protective adult for their younger self that they needed but didn't have. Recovery also involves practical relearning. Adults who were parentified often need explicit permission and practice to engage in playfulness, spontaneity, and rest. They have to actively work against the voice that says taking a break is lazy, that fun is frivolous, that they should always be doing something productive. They might need to learn basic self-care, not because they don't intellectually understand its importance, but because their nervous system interprets self-prioritization as dangerous, as abandonment of others who need them. Building healthy relationships becomes a focused area of work. This means learning to recognize and avoid partners who want them primarily as caretakers, learning that relationships can involve mutual support rather than one-sided giving, learning that vulnerability isn't weakness but actually the foundation of genuine intimacy. It means practicing saying no, setting boundaries, asking for help, all things that might feel profoundly uncomfortable at first. Many individuals in recovery describe having to essentially learn who they are separate from their caretaking role. They might explore interests they never had time for as children, experiment with hobbies purely for enjoyment rather than achievement, practice making choices based on what they want rather than what others need. This identity development, which should have happened naturally during adolescence, becomes a deliberate adult project. There's also often a need to reckon with complicated feelings toward their parent. Some people feel anger, recognizing that their childhood was sacrificed, that they deserved better. Others feel protective of their parents, understanding that the parentification often arose from the parents' own pain and limitation rather than malice. Many experience both simultaneously, holding space for the reality that their parents did the best they could with what they had while also acknowledging that their best wasn't good enough, that harm occurred regardless of intent. Community and social support play vital roles in healing. Many find connection through support groups, either specifically for adult children of dysfunctional families or for people dealing with similar struggles. These spaces offer something powerful: the recognition that you're not alone, that others share this specific kind of exhaustion, this specific flavor of resilience mixed with woundedness. They provide opportunities to practice receiving support in a low-stakes environment, to learn that needing help doesn't make you weak or burdensome. The journey isn't linear. There will be moments of profound progress followed by times when old patterns resurface under stress. Someone might spend months practicing boundaries only to find themselves in a crisis situation, reverting to their old role as everyone's caretaker. But healing doesn't require perfection. It requires patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to keep trying even when it feels impossible. What many people discover is that healing isn't about erasing what happened or becoming someone different. It's about integration, about holding both the strength they developed and the wounds they sustained, about honoring the child who survived by growing up too fast while also allowing that child to finally rest. It's about recognizing that yes, they're capable and resilient and strong, and also they deserved better, also they were just a kid, also it wasn't fair. The most beautiful outcome isn't becoming someone who never helps others or who walls off their heart. It's becoming someone who can choose when and how to give rather than giving by default out of guilt or fear. It's developing the capacity to be strong when needed but soft when safe. It's learning that being human means having needs, that asking for help is brave, that you don't have to earn your place in other people's lives by being useful. For anyone who recognizes themselves in this story, who feels that bone-deep exhaustion we started with, know this. The fact that you survived what you survived, that you kept others afloat while barely treading water yourself, that speaks to an incredible strength. But you don't have to keep proving that strength. The child you were deserved protection, deserved to just be a child. The adult you are now deserves rest, deserves care, deserves to take off that invisible crown sometimes. Healing is possible. Your worth isn't measured by what you provide. You matter not for what you do, but for who you are. If this resonated with you, if you felt seen in these words, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the hidden psychology of human experience. Take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else be strong for you.